Hello, everyone. It is July 9th. This is this week's episode of Superpower Logic. I'm your host, Richard Swank, along with my co host, Kelly. And there's a lot to discuss between what's going on with Graham Platner. Iran is heating up, and we'll touch on everything. But first, Kelly, how was your 4th of July and your 250 celebration in?
Richard, you just couldn't wait to throw that one in, could you?
Nope.
I had a wonderful 4th of July and 250, and I just want the record to show that I was surrounded by Americans in an area of Canada that is very American, very patriotic. We had a nice big fireworks display. I sat my son and my nieces and nephews down and I taught them constitutional principles. We did all day instead of playing on the beach. We went through lessons. So I did, of course, take the opportunity to remind the youngins I was around of just what, we are celebrating. And so one of the interesting posts was about Thomas Jefferson had a receipt for something he bought on January or in July 1776, and it was beer and cards. And the idea was that he was going to celebrate the Declaration being signed. So I got the opportunity to share a little bit of history, pass it on to the next generation. How about yours?
I know you aren't. And as said last week, we love our friends to the north. They're the
Mhm.
best. Mine was great. It was really hot here in Colorado. It celebrated with Lisa, my mom. My mom's 85, and she's a very, very patriotic lady. And so 4th of July has always been her favorite holiday. So there were some cold beers, some brats, hot dogs, burgers. We started the celebration on Thursday and carried through the weekend. And of course, as a former Air Force guy, absolutely loved the amazing display of air power over New York and particularly Washington, D.C. And fireworks were great and just a wonderful, wonderful weekend. And 250 was amazing. So always a good time.
Yes.
Now, what's not a good time is the crap that's going on in Maine with Graham Platner. So on the two-way platform, I cannot take credit because I was one of many, you as well, that basically said he's not going to make it till November. And I've said it on previous editions of this podcast. And now he has suspended his campaign. But he really didn't bow out gracefully. He basically threw the Democratic Party under the bus, saying that they're not giving him the tools to continue. And I found the irony of what he's going through and what the party is doing. No fan of Graham Platner, by the way, so he's no victim. I realize I just made it sound that way for a hot second, but the Democrats are in the same conundrum they were in 2024 with President Biden, and I think it highlights their lack of leadership. That their process is not established, and there's clearly no captain of this ship right now and how things are going to proceed moving forward. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on everything.
First of all, I'm not a Mainer, so I think we'll both disclaim that really this is, we're commentating on issues in Maine. I don't have a problem taking issue with both parties. In fact, I think one of the big challenges our country face now is that people are so, like you say, team sports, right? And before I kind of get to your question about the, Democratic Party and everything, I will say, I think this presented a interesting challenge for some of the Democrat establishment, right? And we kind of touched on this briefly, but there were many things about this individual that many red flags were popping up. And yet there were begrudgingly, you could tell it wasn't wholeheartedly, but Mr. Plattner received endorsements of many. Like I know Chuck Schumer's was somewhat half-hearted. It's almost like, well, I'm not endorsing him, right? Richard, like we discussed, there were red flags along the way, and it seemed like they were largely ignored. And I think if, as a party, you're going to make your platform so anti Trump because you don't think he's a moral character, right? And you take issue with so many of Trump's behaviors and he's such a bad guy and all of this, you've got to be really careful about the people that you then nominate and elect to office, because if you spend over a decade running against a flawed character, well, when that comes around full circle, and you don't apply the same standards and rules to your party, you kind of set yourself up for a little bit of a conundrum or a potential situation. What is the Democratic Party? Who's the leader? Like, why are they kind of tolerating this? with just the internal struggles. But one thing that it kind of bothers me, and it's not, I feel like it's not getting talked about as much as, you know, again, for over a decade, the Democrats made character and moral virtue a big, huge part of their platform. Yet here we watch, establishment party leaders turn a blind eye to a Nazi tattoo. And to be fair, the totem comp maybe isn't mainstream associated with Nazism, but it wasn't just that, right? It was the Reddit comments. There were allegations made. You look at the New York Times and their investigation of the original set of allegations, and she's actually that Lynn woman has been tweeting a little bit about it. She gave them so much more background. They really did not dig into it, but she's a conservative woman, right? So, and maybe we can't, maybe that doesn't even matter because it just seems like they didn't want it to be true, right? But New York Times, if you're the paper of record, they have to live with that now. And then the stories just kept coming, right? And then finally they got so bad into the point where, this woman, the most recent allegations, I'm not saying I agree or disagree. I'm only saying this woman presents as a legitimate woman. She even continued to say she still supports his causes, but the behavior was not okay. But now suddenly here we are, and it's those like, what's the tipping point? And again, you made yourself a party that criticized Donald Trump's character. And he's a flawed character.
Oh,
I'll
yeah.
admit that. But many people held their nose to vote for Donald Trump, right? And it wasn't even always a vote for Donald Trump. In many cases, people felt like they had no other options. I'm not voting for him because his history and misrepresented some of the allegations in the past against him. Where is that story in the media? Like, where are we hearing about New York Times really failing to investigate?
I'm very much of the opinion that Donald Trump is the reason for Graham Platner. A very difficult seat to take from Senator Collins in Maine, and a bunch of consultants tied to Mamdani picked this guy, and I believe it was Eric Erickson that said the establishment's a lot of things, but one thing it really is it's professional. It's good at this. The establishment would have vetted this guy and
Yeah.
figured this out. And I think of what happened to Senator Al Franken when he got ran out by the likes of Amy Klobuchar and those folks in the Democratic Party. What happened to Governor Cuomo? I mean,
Yeah.
nothing either one of those gentlemen did is even in the same universe as what Graham Platner is accused of. And I mean, I was boggled that anyone with a Nazi tattoo would even be considered by the Democratic Party or any political party in America to be deemed as qualified to run for the United States Senate. So it's a real shame. But I put this on Trump because I think the Democrats, they're a huge leadership factor at the level, the DNC level, both houses of Congress. They certainly don't have, at least to me, very impressive potential presidential candidates in 28. When they get a chance to defeat the president, as they put it, even though the president's not on the ballot in Maine
Yeah.
this year, they're going to take it. And if that means it's a very flawed candidate who has a decent chance to win, they're going to look the other way. And eventually, with Plattner, the mud got too thick and deep, and they couldn't ignore it anymore. I'm certainly not a expert on Maine politics, but I do find it interesting that a state like Maine, that many people came out to support Mr. Plattner.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting, to your point about the establishment party, they probably wouldn't. They probably would have vetted a little harder or better. That being said, they basically admitted in a recent article that the vetting was done. Well, I don't know if they're trying to say, well, we weren't a part of it now, right? So they don't look bad, save face, but basically, the Wall Street Journal, according, to their research, his rise happened completely outside the Democratic Party's establishment, and he was really picked by a group of activists.
Yeah,
And
and because the establishment didn't think they could win
yeah,
Maine. They weren't even gonna
and
bother.
but again, like it's indicative of the far left and their relationship and their role to to the establishment and the party, whether they don't see these candidates coming, they don't take them seriously enough. We're now seeing, I'm seeing what I makings of a pattern here, right? The candidate rises up, the traditional candidate is, ousted, and this, this new person comes in, and like we saw in New York, these far left socialist candidates, will they make the cut? But if I was the establishment Democratic Party, I'd say, whoa, we got to get control of our nomination process here, because we're losing it to activists. And as we know, in the primaries, especially, it's a different audience. It's a very, very motivated, active, dialed in audience that can often be largely have different values and beliefs and concerns than general election voters. Similarly, the Republican Party, they didn't know what to do with Trump. Like, no one really
Right.
know what to do with Trump. They didn't take him seriously.
When he started, he was laughed at, and
Yeah,
I'm not saying rightfully so. When he started his campaign, he came down the escalators and stuff. I'm hard pressed to be critical of the Republican Party for dismissing Donald Trump when he came on the political stage. That being said, he did defeat them,
yeah,
and for the Democrats, Bernie Sanders. If it wasn't for how the Democrats run their conventions and the establishment, whether it was Pelosi or Obama or
yeah,
President Clinton, but they got him out of there twice and put their own people in. I think it's going to be one of those situations moving forward where I don't want to say the adults in the room, and I'm not a big James Carville fan, but he really calls balls when strikes. And I'm not sure how many people in the Democratic Party listen to him, but he
yeah.
still gets a fair amount of airtime. And I do find his commentary to be somewhat of old school playbook for how he thinks the party should proceed forward.
Yeah, and to circle back to your original question, as now what do? Ignore the will of the voters? Because while it may not be an official pattern yet, I'm sensing this trend, right? Where now, to your point, with Bernie in 16, even Biden in 2020, and certainly in 2024, they did not listen. I mean, it's crazy that one party's campaign is running against the man destroying democracy, but that same party didn't allow their voters any input into the selection process of their candidate. And it's not a good look to completely ignore the will of the Maine voters, and how they handle this, I think, is going to be important, because they've already got a short rope left because of their previous behavior. So how they handle it, do they hang themselves with it, or do they, do something? But again, it is the will of the Maine voters. And I think what's unique about Maine, and every state is unique, but there's this mentality in Maine very much is, we're different. We operate We don't want to be like Washington, right? And we want to get rid of like the elites, right? The fight against Susan Collins is that she's so establishment, DC. And again, it's so ironic though. Like, the average voter thinks they're fighting against the elites. Well, Platner was handpicked and vetted by a bunch of elites, right? So activist elites. And
Well, I do think it's interesting too, as we wrap up Plattner, but AOC never endorsed him.
yes,
And again, to the extent that political advertising matters in this media environment these days, traditional political advertising, commercials, and whatnot, that's something that nobody can hang around AOC's neck. She did not endorse him, and to my knowledge, really stayed out of that completely, even when asked about it. So there's
she's
going to there's going to be some reckoning within the party on how they handle this.
she's
And
being accused now of being an establishment,
yeah,
right?
she's been there long enough. Right. I don't know what the measuring stick is for when you go from being an outsider to an insider in Washington, D.C., but I have heard some people say AOC's, a part of the problem now, some of these DSA folks. AOC is just I think she's navigating these DSA waters pretty well at the moment. And, we'll see how it all plays out moving forward. I would not, even though House members traditionally have never done very well in presidential races, I think the way AOC is conducting herself, I think she might be laying the groundwork for a run in 28.
Interesting. Although I have to, this rise of socialism is, and the DSA, this rise of socialism, as we kind of celebrate our 250th, and I'm reminding of the founding fathers and whatnot. I gotta be honest, I'm gonna go a little nerd on you here, but I want to kind of bring it back to what the purpose and role of government is. Because I personally see this rise in socialism and the lack of understanding of the principles this country was founded on as a great threat to our nation and future prosperity. So I made a little tweet thread where I want to go back and refer to Mr. James Madison. My concern is the way our government and society and thus was built was on certain principles that we can't forget today, and I think they're really relevant in the time of the socialism. So I just want to throw back here to James Madison on purpose and role of government, and him specifically because he was the father of the Constitution. He was key in writing it, and he was also key in the Federalist Papers, which was a series of papers written by Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and some by John Jay to help get the Constitution ratified. Because one of the things we forget is we won the Revolutionary War, and then we were operating under the Articles of Confederation, and it didn't take this young country very long to realize that we're not going to be able to prosper under the Articles of Confederation. So not only did these guys beat the British, right? Then 10 years later, they were able to write a brand new constitution and convince the states to turn over some of their power, right, to a federal government that they just fought heavily against in order to because there are certain things the states can't do. I think James Madison, his philosophy is important, simple to understand. And as the father of the Constitution, he clearly defined the government's purpose in his Federalist Papers and his writings, not to engineer society or equalize outcomes, but to protect individual rights, faculties, and justice. Here's what he actually said. And remember, this is the man, that kind of wrote it, put it together. In Federalist number 10, the protection of the diversity and faculties of men, which is basically different abilities, it is the first object of government. From those unequal facilities comes different property interests and factions. Government's job, manage the factions' effects without destroying liberty. The great object, secure the public good and private rights. And by this, you do using a republic with representation, large territory. But this is really important, this one here. So our country has been founded on this idea of equality of opportunity, right? And the government has ever even had any success in trying to create a quality of outcome, which I believe socialism is. And so just go a little further. In Federalist number 51, in Madison's eyes, justice is the end of government. It's the end of civil society. And this is a direct quote from him here. It ever has been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained or until liberty be lost in the pursuit, right? And he goes on to say, if men were angels, no government would be needed, right? But since we're not, since we're flawed, right? We have to have a government. So we agree to enable government to control the governed. And then the big key here is then oblige it to control itself. And government is instituted to protect property, right? This property. And when we say property, we mean, yes, it's money, it's ownership, but it's also to keep the fruits of your labor, property of every sort, as well as that which lies in the various rights of individuals. This being the end of government, that alone is a just government, which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. So property here, rights, opinions, conscience, liberty, faculties. So we will give you a quality of opportunity. That's all we can promise, right? But it's incredibly important. And finally here, so to do this, he said limited government rooted in the people, which checks and balances, right? This is the idea of the three separate branches, state government checking federal government, and focus on justice and rights protection, not promoting uniformity. This is really important here, not promoting uniformity, factional favoritism, or unlimited power. A republic with representation and large territory best secures this. And so the takeaway here, government exists to secure your rights impartially so you can pursue the happiness. And when it becomes a tool of the factions or overreach, it fails its fundamental purpose. I think this is really important because the minute government starts to control outcomes, right? Or try to make things equal. Nobody will ever be happy. We'll never have satisfaction, right? Because it will always be, well, so and so got more, or, so and so didn't get enough. And as you take away, you look at some of the countries around the world where when they start to take away, whether it be through taxation or in some cases, like, we're discussing here in California, this wealth tax, which is a complete, different idea. And what's interesting is there was no income tax until the kind of the progressive era and when when the 16th Amendment passed. And when it was first written, Richard, it was only meant to tax the very, very, very rich, right? If you made over $3,000, which if you had over $3,000 of income, back in the 1910s, that was a lot of money. But how quickly then it got spread down, and it correlates directly with the expansion of government. And then we really see in the 30s under FDR. We get through the progressive era, like Woodrow Wilson really, started to expand it. And we get our first safety nets, this Social Security, which we know now is a house of cards, right? And then we see the expansion. You get into estate taxes, and before this, the federal government relied largely on tariffs and import taxes and whatnot. And so a government with unending ability to tax from its citizens is one that can easily overreach, right? It's much easier to start reallocating resources and shifting them around. But if you look at the eras of extreme prosperity here in America, it coincides largely with less government, right? And I want to be clear, I'm not advocating for, a world with no laws and no regulations. But the way our system was designed, it was designed also to have a federal government with so much power like we see now. The states were supposed to check and control the power of the federal government. And we start amending processes like and states and to the federal government. But now here we have a Congress, a legislative branch that is essentially feckless and hasn't been doing their jobs. And we see like the executive branch increasing power and the judicial branch. I hear this populist support for this socialism and the idea. To me, it is deeply concerning and frightening because the way our system was designed, I don't see socialism fitting in very well, or I see it maybe hampering, some of the rights. And I want to side note, our government was not perfect. Never, our founders weren't perfect. Yeah, plenty of things that we did have to amend over the years. And I'm not advocating for a return, to the world of the 1780s and 1790s. I am advocating for the basic principles it was founded on. So
We got a new professor, Professor
I
Kelly. I've made it very clear my position on DSA, and I don't think they need to be a viable path moving forward. I wish the Democratic Party success in trying to get rid of them, which, and I mean politically. I think Senator Fetterman's the only Democrat that's really speaking clearly on this. Although I think former President Clinton has said some pretty good things about the threat that DSA presents. I am somewhat encouraged and optimistic that the people voting for these DSA candidates up to this point, it's not a large amount of people. These primaries are the more passionate, dedicated voters, and I don't believe that the DSA movement is a national threat at this time. And I know people might be thinking about Bernie Sanders when he ran for president. Bernie Sanders never presented himself as a DSA candidate. He caucuses with the Democrats in the Senate, and yes, he's got some socialist leanings, but he was not running as a Democratic Socialist of America when he was running for president in 2016 and 2020. People equate Bernie to the DSA just yet, and I also think a lot of people that vote for some of these candidates don't really understand what they're voting for. And I'm not trying to give a history lesson on socialism and all of its
no,
problems,
yeah,
you know, but I really think that a lot of people, it just sounds so good. You can freeze rent, like, that sounds amazing because my rent's really expensive, and I live in Manhattan with 4 roommates in an 800 square foot apartment, but the X's and O's making the sausage to enact these policies is something that these candidates don't understand. I think the mayor of New York City is discovering that firsthand right now. Again, it sounds great, some of these ideas to particularly younger people, but actually doing it and figuring out a way to do it is a whole other thing. So
yeah.
again, It's like promising kids, "You're gonna get this, you're gonna get that for Christmas," and they run out of it, or you don't have enough money to buy it. And you need to have a plan before you make these promises, and I don't believe that DSA really has a plan. I give DSA credit in one area. At least they say something other than Trump's bad. We must defeat Trump. So, I mean, they say that too, but the mayor of New York City, when he was running for the office, he had ideas. They were bad ideas, but at least he had something. I think a lot of Democrats, if the football coach of your team just said, "Well, on Sunday we're gonna try to win the game," that's not a game plan, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I go, of course you're gonna try to win the game. That's your job, but there's a means to that end, and that's where I think the DSA really falls short. They present these grandiose macro ideas, and they always present them. Listen, this stuff is easy, and the reason it's not being done is because the establishment is bad and they have it in for you. So yeah, I am going to freeze your rent. The buses are going to be free. There will be free health care for all. Medicare for all is the right idea. It's going to happen. The only reason it doesn't happen is because of the big bad insurance companies and the establishment in both political parties. And it's just not that simple, but it sounds so good. And when they present it, they also give you the boogeyman. Not only do I like it, but I can blame somebody for the way things currently are. And that is straight out of the history books for socialism. And, things go downhill quickly. And I think we'll be seeing that in New York City with the mayor to the extent he can't even any of his ideas implemented. I mean, heck, he can't even pay the police department on time. So he's got a lot of problems. And I said this last week. We can't take the DSA for granted.
Yeah.
They're going to be a lot easier to defeat right now with just a few congressional candidates and the senatorial candidate in Michigan than maybe in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years.
Yeah. I don't want to sound too frightened and afraid, but I do have concerns with really, our education system is really doing a poor job of even just teaching the basic writing, reading, and arithmetic. And as a society, it makes us a little more vulnerable to some of those attractive things. But to your point, like you can make a lot of promises, right? It's really easy to make the promises. The hard part is executing them, and carrying them out, which is one of the things I find really fascinating. Gaza, they can't support that with facts and whatnot, or even some people that is like, well, we need to give them more money. Well guys, those are foreign countries, right?
Well, and Israel's the ultimate boogeyman.
Yeah.
To my point earlier, it's like the Michigan Senate debate that just took place with Abdul El Said. I don't know how many times he
They-
said APAC in the debate, but again, I think Israel is a concern for the radicals on the left. Well, and there's radicals on the right. I mean,
Yeah.
both sides of the aisle have populist movements, and I think they both use Israel as a boogeyman for a lot of things. They come at it from different angles, but they both use it, and it amazes. But I don't think that will translate to every district, every congressional district in America. People still are concerned about education. They're concerned about gas prices, inflation, and that is something that we're going to see play out in November with the
Yeah.
midterms because the Democrats really are all over the place with these candidates. And these DSA folks get a disproportionate amount of time on corporate media, and so I'll be fascinated to see if the Democratic strategy of the DSA folks saying all these pie in the sky ideas, Trump's bad, we need to stop supporting Israel, how that fares against the Republican message in place,
Yeah.
and it's more local here. Here in Colorado, and what I've heard from people living in different states, and I've traveled a little bit during this election season, everybody just says, I'm going to get Trump. I'm going to fight Donald Trump and slow him down. Even people, running for the Board of Regents for the University of
Yeah.
Colorado, the university system here in Colorado, their campaign ads were all about Donald Trump. Just ridiculous. So, but they do have this message. We'll see how it plays out in all these elections this fall.
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things I kind of brought up Israel, and I don't want it to kind of hijack the show, but when I hear a candidate running like in a certain part of America, and their first, like their big bullet point, their top issue is what's happening in a foreign country, I then am like, okay, well, first of all, we don't control foreign countries. But then their second items, like some of them are, yeah, like free rent, gonna freeze the rent. We're gonna abolish ICE. They just seem so unpractical to me, but they resonate, right? They're emotional. They resonate. And kind of like we've been saying, it's going to be very interesting come November, how this message is received by the general election voters. And even so, it's not a presidential year. So you're even going to have a little bit of different voter maybe than you did in 2024. And to the point about what are the Republicans running on? What is their issues they're running on? And are they going to have to separate themselves from Trump, or how do they do that?
I think the Republican races are going to be more local. They're that consistent national Democrat message about defeating and fighting President Trump and DSA candidates with some of their more grandiose ideas. That's pretty clear what their path is moving forward. I think Republicans are all over the place. I think the president is a lot to blame, has to carry a lot of the blame for what is being said in congressional races. These pie in the sky things with no details is something the president loves to do and is politically acceptable now, even on the Democratic side. He just did it yesterday in Turkey when he said, "We're just going to start building Patriot missiles in Ukraine." It's like, well, okay, well, there's a lot that goes into that. And he acts like he can just, snap his fingers and these factories in Ukraine, and Ukraine manufactures a lot of weapons. But maybe you should talk to Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed and Rocketdyne and all the companies that build parts of these interceptor missiles. And he just says that kind of stuff. And Democrats, they say crazy things now too. And it's okay to say that. And it's really not relevant to the campaign. Saying that we're not going to give military aid to Israel, one congressperson can't affect that change.
Yeah.
But it sounds great. I want to eliminate ICE. You're one senator, Senate candidate from Michigan. How exactly, 25 years ago, people would have been like, how exactly are you going to eliminate ICE?
Yeah.
Even the president of the United States can't just eliminate ICE. And so,
Yeah.
so it's really degraded. I mean, our politics have been degraded for a long time. But I really blame the president for these really stupid ideas that people on both sides present, and they just don't get challenged. And it's just throwing feed to a bunch of chickens, and they don't care where that feed came from. They're going to eat it. And people are gobbling up what these candidates are saying, these pie in the sky ideas that in practice have no chance of ever happening.
Yeah. Yeah. The candidates, when they just become so ridiculous, the people just get so frustrated and feel so unheard, right? And just seems like, again, to your point, Plattner, I agree, was largely a result of Trump, right? And then you go back to, well, what was Trump a result of? And general dissatisfaction with, and I think especially our federal government, when you see the large waste. I think personally, I'm in New York. I'm deeply frustrated with some of my state government, but my local town, I'm less frustrated by. But I'm not sure some people even see the kind of the distinction either. And the way we interact with each of these governments and groups is different. Richard and I met each other on the two-way community. It's a great app, and they do shows hosted by Mark Helper. And on one of the post shows, we discussed with the federal government, right? We see Congress become largely feckless because they are not doing their job, which is to legislate, pass laws, and create them. And then we see an executive branch whose power is expanding. And when I'm talking about these, I'm not talking about under just the Trump administration or Biden. These are patterns we've seen. And Congress under both Democrats and Republicans, right? These are trends I think, we've been seeing for a while. And the Supreme Court, we've seen the rise of bureaucracy and the rise of the unelected administrative level in Washington, right? A lot of these agencies and like the EPA, there's a great example of an organization, Environmental Protection Agency, who has seen its power and role expand. We never see federal government spending less money. I mean, how often do you ever see government spending less money, or try to be more efficient or try to improve? But I guess what are your thoughts? Will we just see populist after populist until something changes in the government?
Well, I think that there's going to be populism on both the conservative slash libertarian side and the liberal side, largely against what they view are political or establishment elitists, whether it's government in Washington D.C., which I think is more the conservative target for the populist movement, and where the the liberal side of the aisle, it's probably more corporate America, big pharma, things of that nature, the extreme wealth of the tech CEOs and executives and the military industrial complex. So you have these two sides. And, Elon said that Doge, he could have cut 50% of the government. And I totally agree with that. I mean, there's so many examples. Look, for example, during Biden's administration, I mean, we all know Biden wasn't there.
Yeah.
I mean, he was checked out. He certainly was not putting in the hours that a normal president, certainly in our lifetimes, none of them were working 3 hours a day.
Yeah. I
Okay,
mean,
you can make an argument that Reagan might have not have had the best last couple of years,
yeah.
but he certainly was more visible than someone like Biden was, and the country ran fine. I mean, I don't mean policy wise, but people got their Social Security, federal workers got paid, taxes were collected, some of these basic things the federal government does, right? And the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, he literally checked out for 2 weeks
Yeah.
and nobody knew where he was. He didn't tell the president where he was, for crying out loud. And, the Department of Defense still functioned. So the
Yeah.
idea that Congress and the president, they're not the government is so large that no one person, even the president, cannot impact radical change in such a short amount of time. But that goes to kind of a theme of our conversations lately is Congress and how they have just completely abandoned their duties.
Yes.
And being in Congress, the founding fathers did not envision Congress being a full-time job.
No.
And I would argue that Congress would better serve the country if they acted more like most state legislatures do,
Yeah.
where they meet in the spring for a few months, they address legislation, and they go home. And certainly the president, there's ways to recall Congress, whether they have to declare war or vote on something, special legislation. The president has that ability. But Congress right now is so focused on things that are not their duties in the Constitution at all. And it's a real shame. And I think the Supreme Court has done some things to try to throw it back to Congress and restrain. I would say that the executive branch has not exercised too much authority. I would say at times they've had no choice.
They have to act. So, like, I think let's take the border is a great example, right? Like Trump, he had reined it in. I mean, they called Obama the deporter in chief for a while, right? And he did. And but Obama was just doing what was necessary to protect the country and the citizens. And Trump came in and he tightened things up. And of course, COVID hit and really things got shut down. Biden comes in, the border opens up. Whether you can argue how much control and how much was this Biden truly, right? Either way, the border, we know it opens up. And they didn't start under that administration. It didn't start to get reined in till it was proving to be extremely politically costly. But so then Trump comes in and Trump runs on, I'm going to stop the crisis at the border. He comes in, issues executive orders, and shuts it. We can't govern by executive order because every time a new administration comes in, even if it's the same party, right, they might have a little bit of a different philosophy and writes a new executive order or it expires or, they repeal it, issue another one. But they don't have a choice. Like in this case, the Trump administration had to issue these executive orders and to kind of control what had happened under the Biden administration. But now, okay, with Congress, why don't you guys solve the problem?
Yeah, I mean, the whole executive order thing has gotten out of control, and both parties abuse it when they're occupying the White House. And again, some of them are just absolutely necessary because of what happens or what does not take place on Capitol Hill and how they refuse to do their job. And it's a real shame that we're at this point, and we're going to be facing some serious issues here, I believe, because to your point about the border, I'm all so cynical. Okay, I don't need enough evidence to convict somebody in a court of law. Everything that happened with the open border is about voting,
Yep.
pure and simple. It's about voting and fraud. These people, Democrats think someday that these people might become voters and they're going to need public assistance. And we all know public assistance is highly corrupt. And that's probably putting it mildly, depending on where you are. But it certainly is a hell of a racket.
I want to make this important distinction. The people say, "Well, we had large immigration historically. We've never had large immigrant wide open borders and a pretty well established welfare state, right?" The welfare state and the welfare programs were really, I mean, initially under FDR, so it was Social Security, but then, under LBJ, where we see welfare, Medicaid, Medicare, and then they've been expanded since and include public housing. So if you have immigrants coming over where they have to make it on their own, right? There's no safety net for them. You're going to get people that are going to work hard, right? And it's make or break, right? But you have an open border in an economy in a country where there are, and especially it, can vary by state, by philosophy, where there are public benefits available, you may get a different crowd.
The absolute protection that these scandals are given just baffles me, especially when I don't even think it's an 80-20 issue. It's a 90-10 issue. Who
Yeah.
who the hell is in favor of taking advantage of Medicare and Medicaid
Right.
or food assistance programs? I can't believe people in Los Angeles County and the city are not in the streets. Like, are you kidding me? Like some of them, that one building had, several hundred hospice companies.
Yeah.
Their business addresses were in one, small building. It just, don't get me started on Minnesota and the Leering Center and all that. But I'm a believer in Occam's razor and hell. It's not like I don't think many people are going to go to jail for any of this fraud. But if daycare centers in Minneapolis were legitimate, then where are all these families who don't have daycare anymore?
Right.
What are they doing with their kids?
Yeah. Then there should be parents screaming in the streets. Hey,
Exactly. It's a summertime. My kids need daycare,
because
and nobody
we
is
know,
screaming.
yeah, we know there is a shortage of high quality daycare and like educational daycare centers that many parents today face. Like it is a real issue. And, but you don't hear these people's parents screaming, which to your point is so indicative, right?
And this is where something I'm a very harsh critic of Congress as an institution these days, but this is where Congress could do something about this problem. Right now, it's divvied up to the states, and then once they get the money from the federal government, they manage it. Congress
Yeah.
could change the process,
Yes.
but they won't because they're in on it too. Not all of them, but enough of them are, or they have friends at home who are. And
Or those lobby organizations fund the Congress members' campaign, right?
yeah, it's all I mean, it's awful because Citizens United, the Supreme Court ruling, I agreed with it in principle that corporations have First Amendment rights. That being said, the fact that they can fund these super PACs and just flood it with money and get around campaign finance laws because
Yeah.
they're not giving it to the actual candidate or the actual political party is is awful. And I know Democrats hated Citizens United, but they sure as hell utilize it.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Like, George Soros has no problem giving money to PACs.
totally. And we do need to tighten up campaign reform and financing. But again, it's like you have to let the fox in the hen house. The fox isn't going to see its way out and close the door for right. Congress, what is their interest in, especially like in the House where they're basically permanently running for election,
Yeah,
right?
and campaign finance, an American I admired very much, Senator, John McCain, that was his cause in many ways, and I was and still am a big fan of campaign finance reform, but it's never gonna happen, certainly not in my lifetime, and immigration reform. I will concede that the overwhelming majority of people who cross the southern border, um, of the United States, even during the Biden administration, they're just looking to make money and they
Yeah.
work hard and they contribute. And it's probably a dirty phrase on the conservative side of the house, but they do jobs that Americans won't do.
Yeah.
Dave Chappelle said, come on, you act like you want to pick your own strawberries. And he's right. So,
To a certain extent, the same thing was said. Well, we can't free the slaves because, right? Who will work in the fields, right?
right.
And so
That was a body slam.
I agree and I don't agree. It's like look, there are plenty of people that are could use work, right? What would you rather do? Do some manual labor, earn some, well, we know because the other option is collect government benefits. We're talking about the people that, have that clearly are able to work or like are working under the table yet still collecting, government benefits is part of the issue. I know nobody wants to go do manual labor or whatnot, but if you said, "Hey, Kelly, this is you support your child, you got to do this for a little while." Like, it's a
Right.
job, pays money, right? Not
Right.
ideal, but I just that argument, that issue, it kind of grinds me a little because, well, when did Americans become above work, right?
Right, and I do not remember all the different type of work permits, the seasonal workers.
Yeah,
I don't remember the acronyms for all the different programs. And again, immigration reform would allow, if they did it right, it would allow for people to come here, pay their taxes. I would hope that it would allow for some way for illegal aliens who are working
yeah,
to come out of the darkness. And I'm not saying I have all the solutions to this problem, but I do think that two things are real. They're here, and the US government's not smart enough to deport all of them. They don't have the money and the resources and the manpower to find them all. I don't believe if you came here illegally that you should be able to become a citizen.
yeah,
You have to go back. If you want to become a citizen, you have to go back and come back and do it the right way.
yeah,
But if you are here illegally and we have immigration reform and you're fine not being an American citizen, do you want to stay here and work? That is something that needs to be addressed because I just don't think the problem's too complex. It's a bowl of spaghetti.
I
If the government under the current laws is not going to deport all these people.
I agree, and I want to be clear. I'm not against immigration. I'm not at all because you just look at some of the immigrants, like, you take an Elon Musk, right? He exemplifies what it means, come to America, work hard, create something, build something. And you look at him alone and how many lives he's improved. I don't know if there's been a person that has ever made more millionaires and billionaires than Elon Musk, right?
When SpaceX went public.
Yeah, SpaceX, Tesla, all the employees, right?
Mhm.
It's not just the stockholders, but the employees. Like, I love that story of was a McKenna. I think she's the CEO or COO of SpaceX. She donated a bunch of shares.
Like 2 million
Million,
shares to the Trump
yeah,
accounts. Yeah, I
yeah.
saw that.
Which is if my son, if I could get money share, right? That would be amazing. But we do need to know who's here, right? There needs to be a vetting process, and in my
Oh,
opinion, if you either can't or won't assimilate to our culture, speak our language, play by our rules and our values and our principles, then
I've always agreed with the Republican position on immigration reform that nothing is going to be discussed until the border is secure. That was always the Republican starting point, and I agreed with that. And now that the border is secure, I would tell Republicans you're going to have to make concessions, and I would tell Democrats you're going to have to make concessions. And I agree with you. We have to know who's here, and that can only happen with a secure border.
yeah.
And unfortunately, I thought what the the administration did with Homeland Security and rounding up people that were not criminals, rounding up people that were just working. Yeah, they're not supposed to be here, but it was sold that we're going to get rid of the bad guys first. And not that we should not address, the people
Yeah.
who are illegally, picking strawberries or washing dishes or doing that type of labor, but we need to get the criminals first, and that's something that I hope is still taking place. They
Yeah,
don't talk
and
about
like
it much anymore.
the optics in Minnesota, just awful, right? Just off.
Awful.
No, nobody should be dying over this. I just see how it was just a recipe for disaster. I blame the local government and local police forces as well, too, right? Why were they not stepping in, and stopping some of this? It's an awful, awful, terrible look, bad. It really left a very bad taste and, in many people's mouths.
The whole sanctuary city thing is
Is a bigger issue too.
I doubt that most local police departments are interested that are in sanctuary cities. I imagine most of them would much rather help the federal government with
Yeah.
immigration law when they arrest somebody because and I know in rural areas it's definitely an issue because they don't have sheriff's departments, they don't have the jail space always. So if they arrest an illegal immigrant and the sheriff has to keep them in their jail for 3 days instead of turning them over to federal agents and they go into federal custody,
Yeah, and I should clarify, when I say the local, like, state the police, they're best suited to deal with the local protesters, right? They
Of
know
course.
that. Like, most of those people were known to Minneapolis PD and whatnot,
Well, they're
and
trained differently too. They're trained in
yes,
crowd control and
yes. I'm like, "This is completely unsafe, the protesters and activists blocking off streets." ICE couldn't get down there. That is dangerous because if somebody on that street has an emergency, EMS can't get down there, right? Levels. The worst part is that's dangerous for innocent bystanders, right? That puts the first responders at risk. Do they go down that street? Do they not? What was happening in Minnesota? And if you're an objective party, both sides need to take responsibility for whether for the things they've done, the dynamics they've set up. I'll never forget, it was Mark Halperin said on the show,
it's interference with official acts. Yeah, you just can't go do that kind of stuff.
let's say SWAT, a local SWAT comes and they're busting down a door. People don't just
Yeah.
walk up, start blowing whistles, right?
It was not a good look. It was
But
an awful time, quite honestly, from some of the stories, DHS wasn't being run very well
no.
under Kristi Noem, and there was a lot of problems, and,
Yeah, and I
again,
never understood Trump's idea. Why not Tom Homan has decades of experience working on with both parties, both sides of the aisle and success. And I thought, like, why is he not in there, like managing this? And he ultimately did go in there, but after it was unfortunately after it was late. And Kristi Noem clearly was, whether you say she was, it's to be debated. I think it's good she's gone. We'll kind of see how Mark Wayne Mullins, how he comes in here. But it left such a horrible taste in people's mouth. And now we still haven't addressed the issues. And what happens after the next executive order? Like, we need to tighten up our immigration. We need proper laws and processes. And it's got to be like a 90-10 issue, right? And we want to be attracting the people like Musk or the people that come here and make a difference, right? And whether the hawks want to admit this or not, the less we get involved in with these overseas wars, or forever wars overseas, the less refugees we create, right?
I see what you're saying, but we take refugees in from
Yeah,
places that we're not involved in militarily, but also it's a double-edged sword to your point. Being involved and because we're involved all over the world, not
yeah,
with kinetic action, but the US military is everywhere. Forget how many countries in the world outside of diplomatic, because every embassy has military at it.
yeah,
But there's US military personnel stationed in a lot of overseas countries, and I agree. We definitely, like Somalia, we kinda created that refugee crisis, but, that's something that we could definitely address is how we accept refugees into this country,
yeah,
and what happened with the Biden administration and some of the executive orders that changed all that, it definitely complicated things, and we need immigration reform. We don't need to change the laws that enforce immigration, in my opinion.
yeah, yeah,
That's my thing, and it's really unfortunate with sanctuary cities because the concept of them was good at first. The
yeah,
original premise was that if you're an illegal alien and you're
yeah.
a
Or
victim of a
you're,
crime or you're a
you're
witness to a crime,
a
we
victim
want
of
you to
domestic violence, something like,
Yes, yeah,
yeah,
you need to feel safe going to the police department and
yeah,
trying to keep a community safe and putting bad guys away. So it really has been it's unfortunate, something that had a good intent to start. It metastasized into what it is now, which is just ridiculous, in my opinion. Sanctuary cities.
yeah, yeah. One of the issues too, like in general, we kind of talk about work, jobs. This administration is successful in reshoring many of the manufacturing jobs and bringing back. We Besant. I love that guy. I got to be honest. Scott Besant. I think he's so intelligent. He understands markets. But he seems to understand something and not be afraid to share it about markets is countries that build their GDP on financial engineering, on service instead of like a productive, right? Like you look at the UK, 80% of their GDP is like service based. So whether that's financial services, insurance services, not just limited to that, but it's no longer a productive economy. We've seen the same thing here in America, right? The shift away from productive manufacturing, if I have to summarize this kind of philosophy, it's no longer money over materials right now. We're back to material, right? I'd be long physical, like I'd be long manufacturing in short markets, just in general, because I think they Besant truly understands the value of a productive economy. And we talked about him a little bit in the past, and I recommended, that if anyone go watch Besant's speech, and he's bringing back very much the Hamiltonian economy. That really Hamilton was very controversial in his time. Obviously, the basic assumption was a government would always do whatever it needed to do to support any critical supplies or processes to make sure the country could defend itself, feed itself, whatnot, and protect those industries. We took for granted when we offshored the manufacturing what it would really do, how important it was to many of the American people and the manufacturing workers, those good, high quality jobs, right? That gave people purpose and satisfaction. And yes, TVs got cheaper, right? Certainly did. But now we have this middle class that is thinning out, and we're further now. We're kind of on the cusp of this AI boom, or we're in this, they call it this AI super cycle. I'm hopeful that Besant and Trump, and I think Rubio's on board with this very much, come back to this national security strategy and the financial architecture and how they all tie together. High paying, high quality jobs where people are building things, and that it's also there for our security, and kind of bring back that mentality, as opposed to just building the cheapest thing, wherever it may be built. And so be it, whatever happens, if our supply chains are threatened and controlled by enemies, I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic that this might be a long shot, but settle down some of this like unrest. I don't know. Am I too optimistic there, Richard?
I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of the mindset that I think that bringing back manufacturing and that America is going to look like it did in the 1950s
Yeah.
is probably a bridge too far.
Yeah.
And
We're not going
uh,
back to the, but
yeah, we're never going to get to that point. I'm very, very optimistic that between COVID and what we've seen in some of the Russia Ukraine conflict, that both sides agree that there's certain things we need to do in America. Chip manufacturing, not relying on China for critical minerals. There's critical minerals in safer parts of the world. There's critical minerals in America. It just takes forever to mine them. Between the permitting and the processes and all the things you have to do, excuse me, it's a lengthy process. So yeah, it's important to bring some of them back. I think the American car industry's gotten better. I think it's great that there's so many foreign car makers with factories, particularly in the South, the Southeast. That's great for local communities. Those are good jobs that have great benefits. And yeah, but we're manufacturing is never going to come back in America like some people want it to. I'm not saying you're one of those people.
no,
I'm
we're
not
we're
saying that at
never
all.
we're never gonna see the days of, like, the end of the 40s, 50s, where the one good manufacturing job at Ford or whatever, was enough to care for a family of maybe 3, 4 kids. The wife didn't work, stayed at home, right? I think that era may be foregone, although I do think there may be an opportunity for some new types of more technical jobs, like we mentioned Micron, the chip manufacturing. Some of these industries, they make sense to bring back here. I don't want the government controlling dictating how companies use their capital and resources, but if the government clears some of the hurdles for like some of these processes, like the chips, to be made here, that's actually a national security issue and defense issue, and anything kind of related to our technology. It would be foolish to look back and say we want that. That's a very nostalgic view. And then you get to like the housing market, and I get so frustrated by some of the conversation there, because you look back and you say homes were so affordable. Now people can't. I think that's missing a little bit of context. One, in the 50s, the suburban build out, that initial wave, right after World War II, the vets come home. Your average home was like 1,200 square feet, right? Compared to it's almost 3 times the size now. Did not have air conditioning, right? You had a refrigerator, maybe a washer and a dryer and an oven, right? But didn't have the appliances. There weren't sprinkler systems built into them. They weren't built-in vacuum systems, like electronics, right? Maybe they had a garage, a small garage. So in that sense, homes have become they're more expensive to build, they're larger and maintain. And we have a little silver tsunami situation. I'll just describe quickly. We have, because interest rates were so low for a while, we have a generation that is staying in their homes when typically at that age they would sell the home to move to a different, either smaller
Yeah,
or boomers aren't leaving, but financially, because homes have become so much more expensive, or in the property taxes, if you've owned your home for so long in so many municipalities, those long-term owners, they don't have the right property tax rates because people come in and complain. So we're somewhat allowing it to happen. If you have a 30-year locked in at 3.25% or whatnot, you're not. Even if you wanted a bigger house or like just even for the non-boomers, even if they could afford to outright buy, the ones that are, they are buying them or they have multiple homes, right, that they're not selling. So I think it'll be interesting when we might be in a crunch when suddenly physically a large section of the population can't maintain their homes and needs the next step. We've seen like senior housing rise, but there's going to be certain areas that are going to be hit harder than that. And I don't know, part of me is like, do we just eat this out a little, right? Because from here on down, the generations get smaller. Am I crazy to think that?
I don't know. I think 90% of the people that talk about housing in corporate media are fools.
Yeah,
There's no such thing as a national housing market, but
yeah,
there's data that is produced by the government about housing metrics across the entire country. But all real estate is local. And the Fed and lowering interest rates is not going to save the housing market. I think one of the biggest issues with the housing market is the reason we built starter homes in the 50s and 60s is because people got married when they were 21, 22, and started having kids. And suburbia expanded, became a thing. When I was 25, I was single and I didn't have any children and I didn't think at all about buying a house. Now I was in the Air Force and I was moving around and stuff, but the marriage rates and the birth rates in America, it's just amazing to me how many people want to buy a home when they're 25 and they don't have a family because it's not more about a life necessity. I think it's more about it's an investment for them, and they
yeah,
feel like they're getting behind if they don't own a home. And I don't think there's anything wrong with buying your first house when you're 32, 33 with, married with a kid or a couple of kids. But there is a perception amongst younger people that that's way too late of a start in life to be buying your house. They don't make starter homes anymore. And the places that in America that have 12, 1,500 square foot homes, they're not in big cities. You're not going to buy a brand new 1,500 square foot single family home in Austin, Texas or Nashville, Tennessee. So it's a housing thing. I don't understand it in large part because all the houses where I live here in northern Colorado that are for sale, they've been for sale for months, years. And yet they're still building condos, single family homes, apartments all over the place.
yeah.
Here's a question for you. Was it all BS, the hedge
Stopping,
funds buying real
stopping,
estate?
stopping the corporations. So it's interesting because it's to your point, it's so indicative of the talking heads not really understanding what the market is because corporations or hedge funds investment REIT is it's a real estate trust, but it's a way to own real estate through a stock exchange. So you buy shares of it, on the stock market, which it historically hasn't really been something. Your only exposure to the real estate market has been if you buy something directly. And it has historically been one of the largest assets of the American family.
Right. But like Ro Khanna was acting like half the homes in America were owned by BlackRock and
No,
State Street. And I was like, it turns out it was way, way less. And
yeah, on the housing market, some of that, the different corporations or different firms interact differently. So you had some that were just buying up single family homes to do mass Airbnb rentals, VRBO. And those were especially problematic for the local municipalities. But then there also are some larger firms, REITs or private equity or some money they're working with developers and they're buying huge plots of empty land and they're developing whole subdivisions and they're actually they build them just to rent them. So in a case like that, you want those corporate players in the market because they're working with the development and especially in some of these southern states and areas, the way the development process works down there, these developers are also building out the infrastructure of the community. Some of these, when we think of it like these southern housing communities, think of it, it's not just a street with a home. It may be large, many tens and tens and or hundreds, of acres. And there's playgrounds. There's, in some cases, they might be building the schools. They're putting the infrastructure in, typically just elementary schools, but and they're building some area for commercial. So there's a little coffee shop you can walk up to. And so when you've got corporations doing things like that, where they are buying them, and yes, they're going to rent them, or they're going to rent portions of them. You don't want to be driving those kind of players out of the market. What you don't want are the players that are buying up all the single family homes in the area, whether they rent them or not, right? They're just buying them up because they're cheap and it's an asset. Maybe they rent them, but especially the ones where you interact with the neighborhood and they are the short-term rentals, they can be really problematic for the local communities. But so I think the players that are an issue, like those ones, many of the local municipalities are going to manage that problem on their own. They're going to restrict Airbnb ownership or by neighborhood. Some HOAs have already started to do it themselves. The the housing market is not, we are not one housing market, right? It varies by not only region, but by state, within a state, by municipality, town, county. And because so much of the laws and rules and building codes, there's a standard best practice building code that, most of the towns do follow, but that's relates to like safety regulations, right? About, you know, smoke detectors and best practices for like
Right.
wiring whatnot. But it's really up to many of these local municipalities, and many. To me, it seems like the best way might be, what are our needs here, and is there ways we can support these local municipalities or towns or jurisdictions to whether just to modernize their building code or kind of some best practices of like, hey, when you require a minimum lot size of 1 acre and each acre costs, you know, $200,000, you're going to look at it. Your home's going to be expensive.
I just think a huge part of the problem is young people aren't mobile.
Yeah.
There is affordable housing. It's just not in where a lot of or where maybe where you're living. And people do not want to, particularly young men, they do not want to move for a job. The lack of mobility in our younger population is a real challenge, and particularly amongst men under the age of 30.
Yeah, I'm outside of Rochester, New York, and there's this cute little village, Pittsford Village. It's an old village along the Erie Canal, and Pittsford schools, great school districts. And I really like the village because you can walk to coffee shops and whatnot, and walk down to the canal and the library. But to have a house, to get a house there, they're expensive. So there's one of two options. You buy one, and they're older, right? The house we bought was from 1908 and it hadn't really been updated. So you buy it, you put a lot of sweat equity into it, right? It's now on YouTube. Guys are showing you how to build a whole house or do things, or there are many ways you can do it and roll your sleeves up. I see there's kind of an unwillingness to do that.
I think that there's demand for so many trades. Mike Rowe was talking about electricians in Texas, talking
Mm,
to people, and he's like, these young electricians are making 240 plus $1,000 a year,
yeah.
and they're in such demand because they just get poached by other companies in the industries down there, and because companies can't train people because nobody's entering into the field.
Yes.
And so when they have a project in their building, they just poach electricians from other projects, other companies, whether
Yeah.
it's in the oil industry, AI, Bezos and Elon with their launch facilities down there, and it's just fascinating. And so to tell a 20-year-old in Michigan, hey, if you really want some opportunity, become an electrician and get your ass down to Texas or get up to North
Or not.
Dakota and work in the oil fields.
Yeah.
Uh,
This idea that Americans, well, who will pick the food? Well, as Americans, right? How many of those people interested in maybe becoming an electrician did we push? Okay, no, push into college where they tried to become like an electrical engineer, right? Instead, where because this notion everyone's got to go to college, get a degree. Like we talked about, many of those degrees are becoming increasingly worthless. And it's so ironic that we have jobs available that pay well and there's demand for them. And I just think I'm going to make kind of a bold prediction here. I think within the next decade or two, we may see a total flipping upside down of colleges, universities, and I expect we're going to start to see some go under financially. We're already seeing a little bit of it, but some will be able to rest on their endowments for a little while, cut expenses. But I believe we're going to see some of that start to happen pretty quickly. And I'll tell you what, I have a son that's 9. What, he'll be 18, 19 when he goes to college. I'm like, what world will he enter? Will it be that we're looking at colleges right away automatically?
There was a stigmatism when I graduated high school in 1992, and I went to a small private Catholic school. I think we had like 65 people in our graduating class, but there was definitely a stigma attached to those that did not go to college or stayed at home and lived with their parents, even if they were working, because back then we were all just itching to leave home, and obviously that stigma is largely gone. But I don't worry about the large public universities. I do worry about small private colleges, places most people have never heard of that do not have, billion-dollar plus endowments.
That we're relying on a lot of foreign students paying
Certainly.
full
Yeah,
aid.
there's a lot of small little colleges that, unless you're from that region, most of the country's never heard of, and those colleges are all over the nation that are private, and, I
And
think
they're
they'll be the first ones to go.
But unfortunately, they in the more rural areas, they're a key employer possibly, right, in the area, and that will further kind of have an impact. I say that about my son, but my son would his ideal would be to drop out of school and go work at John Deere, just take their classes, become a John Deere expert. Like, it's always gonna get better. I do believe I think one of the things that made America so great was you always worked to make sure your children or the next generation had it better. And that was a promise, right? That things just kept getting better. I think there's many ways we take for granted about how much life is better, how much easier we have it, right? That you just look at an iPhone, how many things it can do for you. So I think we do take some of that for granted. And I've not given up on that, but it is hard for me to kind of see the mentality of people so frustrated by that. And I would like to change that. How I do that, I don't know.
We talk about the victim Olympics, and I think populism on the right is much more about ruggedness and independence, and fix my potholes, make sure the power's on, make sure the border's secure, make sure the military's funded and being taken care of, and otherwise just kind of stay out of my business. And I think populism on the left is much more about victimhood and equality of outcome,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
what can you do for me? And I think that is the big difference between the two sides, and the most important difference. Like, there's not, who they're upset with as populists is certainly different as well, but there's some crossover there. But
Yeah.
it's that equality of outcome, and what have you done for me, and what will you do for me, that is just a symptom of the populist movement on the left, which I
And
really find
almost
disturbing.
almost like a learned helplessness, like the thought that I could fix it right?
Right.
That I would have the solution as opposed to, relying on someone else, government. Full circle here with like Madison, right? Government exists to secure your rights impartially so you can pursue your own dream of happiness, right? So you can pursue your happiness, not the government, doing it for you.
Yeah, you see interviews at some of these DSA candidates rallies, and they interview some of the rally attendees, and I always find their interviews somewhat ironic because they're talking about what's not being done for them, and all I'm thinking is, "Wow, you just wasted 3 hours. You could have been applying for jobs or actually working at a job, earning
Yeah.
money instead of standing there listening to this person give you a list of
Yeah.
things that are never gonna come to fruition." But,
That's
I
a great
mean,
point, Richard. Those were 3 hours that could have been spent actually solving the problem.
yeah, I'm sure this conversation goes on in living rooms all across our country with young people in high school and out of high school who feel lost. We all have the same amount of time in the day, and there's no shortage of work. I know that some people say there is. There isn't if you're willing to look in other places besides your own backyard.
Get creative. Also, build your own job, right?
Yeah, there's so many there's side hustles, there's so many things people can do, and the idea that you can't figure it out, there's plenty of ways to enter into the workforce And you know what? You don't have to enter the workforce working a job that's going to be your career for the next 40 years.
Yeah.
I mean,
But
most of us didn't do that.
no, but you said it so well. It is a different kind of populism, right? It is a one, just kind of leave me alone, let me be, right? And another is, what are you going to do for me, right?
Yes.
And I see that we're further apart now. Even previously, like when we were at civil war with each other, we kind of all believed the same idea. Lincoln said it well. Government's like there to clear hurdles, not to do the work for you.
Yes.
So
Cannot agree more.
yes. Well, thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I got a little sassy with Richard.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, some
Yeah.
disagreements. Some of you have said, do you guys ever disagree on stuff? So
Oh, yeah.
now there's proof that we do. And I know we disagree on some other things too. So maybe someday we'll get to that eventually
You just
too.
have to
There's
listening to find out what it is.
exactly. So hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe. And we always welcome your feedback. Thank you very much, Kelly. And we'll see you next week.
Bye. Like, subscribe, and share.